welcome to How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak.
Good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to How I Got Here. These are the inside stories behind travel startups, innovation in travel, transportation, hospitality. So welcome everybody. Our next guest, or this episode's guest, is Gareth Williams. Now, maybe he doesn't need some introduction, but we'll do one anyway. I mean, arguably, it's one of the biggest success stories of the online travel era. Skyscanner went from an idea at university to becoming part of the growing C-Trip empire after a 1.7 billion deal was 3 years ago now. So Gareth, one of the co-founders and the CEO, led the company from its humble beginnings, I guess, as a flight search engine to what is now a major global brand over those 16 years. He then stepped down a little time after the acquisition, and he now sits in the non-exec chairperson seat at the company. Welcome to How I Got Here, Gareth. It's very nice of you to join us today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, right. So we always start these things off with asking you to just kind of give us your 2-minute how you got here, and we'll kind of take things from there.
All right, let's get started. I loved online, everything that was happening online. It was pretty idealistic back then, and but me and Bon and Barry, my co-founders, were doing other stuff, still in technology, but we're doing other stuff during the dot-com crazy years. And it was only during the dot-com bust that we decided to do something ourselves. And we had several ideas. This one to do with basically just finding out who flies where. It's pretty simple and pretty frustrating that it didn't exist in full form. We decided to do that instead of, a bar and restaurant infinite jukebox for music and things, property search, we decided to do this, I think at least in part because we'd built a prototype and could see how it worked, and we're pretty keen on it. So we got started. We really didn't give ourselves enough of a chance that we deserved to ask friends and family for funding or anything like that. It was the dot-com bust years. There was no one really investing at the time. So we just got stuck in, did it ourselves. It's quite a long journey. We've grown year on year. I think I counted up the number of quarters of year-on-year growth. It was a lot and still continues, which I'm really pleased about. And we're sort of up to around about 100 million people using us each month. So it's been very fascinating, very humbling in many ways. So many things we did wrong, and fundamentally rewarding in many ways as well.
Cool. Well, this is David here from Mozio. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast today, Gareth. I'm curious to get a little insight about how, what led to your rise. So, for consumer travel, there's a tendency to just pay $1 billion to Google for AdWords and participate in that rat race. But you were able to create a consumer brand. And I'm curious how you did it. Was there some secret, or was it just, execution early enough?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to that. I think in online travel particularly, I sometimes call online travel the field of broken entrepreneurial dreams. And one of the big problems that I didn't think about until many years after we started was someone came along to Skyscanner today and they said, "Great job, Skyscanner. I'll definitely use you next year." And there's lots of people that go on a big trip, say involving a flight, and they only do that once or maybe twice a year. So, and that really is a killer for a bootstrapped or someone who's in a hurry or needs to deploy lots of funding, because it can take a long time for someone that you've convinced you provide value to come back and show up in the numbers. Now, my perception over the years is most startups under that sort of pressure start inevitably to become transactional, in that they've got to make it work when they get a visitor, because next year is too far away. Funding will dry up, they'll spend all their money, people will lose confidence, all those sorts of things. And of course, you've got investors in that are then saying, well, my other company for, onceadayreminder.com is sort of growing like this, so how come you're not? And so many startups start from the premise that let's provide value to users, and then as it grows and they acquire salaries and things to pay, they learn about business. But most of the time, I think that swing happens too much. And it's partly because of the dynamics of online travel, that relative infrequency. I think for us, we just fundamentally believed that we were doing it, that the main reason was to provide value to travelers. We look at things strategically as a two-sided marketplace now. So we care a lot about airlines and travel suppliers, people who make beds and things. But to begin with, we didn't so much think of them at all. We just said we're going to provide a really useful service to travelers, and if we do a good enough job, it will eventually lead to some sort of value creation or ability to stay afloat. So I think in the early years, it was really useful that we bootstrapped our way up there. And secondly, I think we were first of all product people, second of all business people.
Is that, it's interesting that you say that, Gareth. So did the business elements come some way after building the product in terms of what you were focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, we did our best to build up revenues, and at the beginning, I mean, we needed our own confidence. But yeah, I remember our first commercial director that joined us, and a few years later, he sort of mentioned that he felt like he'd joined someone's hobby rather than a business. And I think he joined at the perfect time, because he could focus on putting some commerciality around what we were doing. Whereas we were worried about that, but we were more concerned that someone would come back. So our very first stat that we tracked, and we used to SMS it from the server. The server used to be up in our lofts originally. And we used to text our daily stats, and the very first one was repeat visitors, and that grew pretty slowly, but it was the one that told us someone had used us and got enough value that they decided to come back to us.
Now, on that getting customers side of things, I mean, Google was 4 years old around the time that you launched, and was probably nowhere near as powerful as it is now in terms of a customer acquisition kind of vehicle. What was your kind of idea and plan at that stage to just get people in the front door to use the thing?
Well, so I think and perhaps speak for myself, but I think I made the very common mistake, which is build it and they will come. And it was kind of like, don't know how this marketing stuff works. Well, we'll try not to worry about it. Let's build it and people will come more. And I think Google was in those days was a big inspiration for us in terms of the dramatic effect better quality software can have. But as a traffic source, it wasn't until we started looking at, well, how do you appear in their search results that it then became of any significance to us.
How long after the launch was that? Was that a couple of years in that kind of turning point?
Yeah, I think it was probably 2 or 3 years, and and an advisor, Jules Pancholi, sat me down and said, this is how it works. And I went, oh, okay, I had no idea. And one of the things I've observed is technical people often just really aren't interested in how you appear in search engine results. And I wasn't particularly, but we really did need to get the traffic. And so we came up with a system and how to do it. And we sat down, and I think one of the key things that relates to earlier is we actually sat down and said, how do we actually answer the question implied by what someone typed in? And I think because we did that, we didn't have to revisit it for a long time. You know, we weren't caught out by penalties and all the rest of it. We were extremely congruent with what Google was trying to achieve there. And so that gradually and over time was a big plus for us. And I think I always, and I think many of us shared this thought that Google was doing really well. It didn't seem right to be a kind of Thomas Piketty mechanism for getting slightly rich people's money and making Google even richer. It just seemed a weird way to go about things. So we were very, very light in using Google advertising for quite a long time.
I guess there's an aside to that, your comment about taking rich people's money and making Google richer, that's something that resonates with some major OTAs these days, but it's probably something that we can move on from. David?
Yeah, so I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into, you mentioned you guys didn't really have a marketing strategy when you started. I feel like the first time I heard of Skyscanner was when I was backing around Europe, and you guys had a feature that you could search from, London to anywhere. And I remember that got a lot of play among the backpackers, and they'd pass it around. And I'm curious at all if there was any kind of thoughts about, how you target young, which I think this is basically what you ended up doing, but I'm not sure if it was on purpose. And did you have any target market in mind? And at what point did you kind of start thinking about this?
Yeah, I think you're supposed to be embarrassed these days, but we built it to solve what we thought our problems were that weren't unique. So we were trying to solve it for ourselves. And I immediately had the broad view over a calendar problem, and I also had traveled a lot, so I had the browse anywhere problem. So we used to, I remember there's a fun period of things when we were going, even when we get all this data, how do we want to display it to people? And we didn't have any kind of background in GDSs or anything else. And so we just thought about it from first principles. And shopping results are keyed around particular days. Well, that's fairly arbitrary as well. So there was a degree of naivety, but I think also a degree of playfulness about what is the best way to give people the data around and turn it into information around, well, where can you go? Where is interesting? So I think we would have lost interest in a way if we hadn't been able to work on those features as a way of bringing something that we didn't see other people doing.
I want to follow up on that a little bit. You guys were one of the first to at least start thinking about multimodal with your acquisition of Zumbu. I think it's become very trendy recently. The first one was probably Rome to Rio, but then Go Euro, now Omio, who we also interviewed as well. And then even guys like Kiwi.com are starting to add various forms of transportation. And how do you, like, I feel like this is relevant to what you just said about different ways of displaying info and just solving your own problem. The multimodal problem has been one that has been there for a long time. How did you guys think about solving that? Did you make a really big effort to do it after you acquired Zumbu, or what?
Yeah, we did. I think so I remember at about that time in Edinburgh, the main bus company is called Lothian Buses. And they had a semi-open API, and there was two people. One person built an iPhone app, and one person built an Android app. And they were programmers. They didn't do much to promote it. And I was looking at the stats, and I kind of looked into how many people are using us in Edinburgh today. And I looked at these one-person part-time efforts around buses. And the amusing conclusion was they're kicking our ass in usage and awareness and in the hometown of where we're based. And, you know, that led on to a lot of thoughts around, okay, what's the frequency of a service and those sorts of things. But the initial insight was, hang on, we don't want to pay other entities lots and lots of money forever or start doing that. So we need to build loyalty. And one of the best ways to build loyalty is frequency. So at that time, we were thinking, well, okay, if we can do from the short, like a bus, through to the rail and then the intercity rail, well, I guess that's, you know, the classic reasoning line around a lot of this. Where it fell down is that we had so much to do in flights that we weren't able to concentrate at that time enough on multimodal. So it kind of remained an aspiration rather than this is the thing that we must do.
What do you think of the players trying to tackle it now, if you don't mind me asking? Do you think the timing is right, or what do you think about their approach?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of utility. I think the big problem is the user interface. And I think being able to solve it as an assistant rather than as a comprehensive display and to be trusted to make the right choices is probably required in order to really nail it. And then of course, you know, that seems to be a key part of the direction that Google's going. So you've got to somehow achieve the label of moving about the world in time and space. That's us. Whereas we're good for, say, British transport, and we've got these modes here, but we've got those modes over there. I think you've got to do the whole lot.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we spoke to, as David was referencing, we spoke to Omeo and got some interesting stuff on that. So I wanted to go kind of take you back a little bit. I'm curious, you know, there was the three co-founders, you and Bonham and Barry. How did you decide who was going to have this two-part question? How did you decide who was going to take each role? And you said earlier, Gareth, that you were a product focused, a business second. When did you switch from being a product guy to having to be the business guy as the CEO? And was it difficult having to do that?
Well, I'll answer the second one first. I'm tempted to say I never switched, and that I mainly solved it through hiring the best people we were able to do on the commercial side of things. I think I don't have any accountancy background or whatever, but to me, a management accounts and management report, what they're showing is the deep underlying question is, does the world care whether you exist? And care enough in order to pay for you to go into work today? And that, I think, is, it's completely the growth metrics, acquisition, activation, retention, referral revenue. They're actually a codifying of the dynamic loop that is how my understanding of a big part of how business works. So I think I never really lost the product focus. I'm well known for telling people that every CEO is a wanker. It's not particularly deep in my soul as what I am. But I'm very glad I did it, because I learned a lot. So that's the second part of it. On the first part of it, it was very informal. We just did the things that we were each better at, and you do something with friends, and you kind of assume you haven't got any. I didn't have a very successful career. You kind of assume that you're kind of okay, but you're probably a bit rubbish, and maybe your friends are a bit rubbish. They're certainly annoying at times. And what I've realized is actually they were incredibly good at what they did, and had skills in directions that we never knew were important. And so for quite a long time, and I think it was only when we went to go get funding, and people wearing suits would kind of say, well, you've got to choose a role. One of you's got to be CEO. And we kind of go, well, why? But eventually we decided to do that. Fundamentally, I think none of us really wanted to be CEO. And I certainly thought, it was a bit of a jumped up position. And the real star in the startup was to be a CTO. My only problem was I didn't want some idiot telling me what to do. So we had a real problem about deciding who was going to be CEO. And eventually, I think partly because of I did the underhand tactic of voting for myself, I became CEO. So it wasn't very clear-cut decision. And it certainly wasn't a obvious decision for some time afterwards.
I've always, I say this as respectfully as I can, I always sensed that you were kind of a reluctant CEO, and almost you've kind of explained that now that perhaps you were.
Yes, yeah. I think the thing that we were good at was all that mattered was whether we won according to what we defined winning as.
Right.
Not getting there, the world didn't care about excuses or write-up of lessons learned and things like that, because in those days, stuck down in Leith, well, nobody was paying any attention to us. So because it was so results orientated, we were all prepared to take on parts of the jobs that we'd really rather not.
And as you grew into that as the reluctant CEO, who by your definition was perhaps a wanker, is there anything that you got into that you just thought, oh my goodness, I'm a little bit out of my depth, whether it was the fundraising or even later on when you were starting to clearly have serious discussions with potential acquirers?
Yeah, I think that happened a lot, and I think the biggest things, one of the things I really regret was I had a lot of the arrogant traits of technologists, which were management doesn't matter, don't need an HR department, marketing will in some future Skyscanner towers, marketing will be in the basement, and programming in the top floor, and things that are essentially saying to other people, what you've learned or what your skill base is don't matter. What matters is the tech. And I'm kind of embarrassed about that now. And I think you can see a lot of it right out in even bigger or, extremely large companies at certain points. And so I think the thing that I wasn't prepared for was actually we're in a people business, and it matters what people think. It matters what they want, and it matters how well we all work together, which is the fundamental variable. Say you're a team of 20 people. If 20 people are doing working somewhere between 50% and 150% of what they might normally do, there's another factor, which is how does the environment work either with or against you in making the sum of the parts much better? And that's such a complicated question, one that generally doesn't live in the absolutes, but in between the extremes, that it's you can spend a lifetime doing it and still feel you're nowhere in terms of reaching conclusions. So I gained a respect for what people achieve with groups of people that I never had before. As a child, all my heroes were individual contributors, sports people, authors, that sort of thing. And it's a real talent, and one that I only partially learned, to be able to coordinate the efforts, the willing efforts of lots of other people.
Great.
Want to bring the questioning over to a little bit to your guys' B2B business. I think I can't count the number of times where I've heard a startup pitch and I ask them how they're getting their flight info, and they go, "Oh, we're using Skyscanner's API." And I remember, I've been in the travel industry for 9 years, and I remember at one point, Mozio was trying to solve the multimodal problem, and we actually got past a bootleg copy of the API docs to Kayak's API for the brief moment that it was in existence. And that's how we built our first prototype. But I was shocked, honestly, we obviously Mozio moved on to other things other than multimodal, so we didn't have the need for a flight API. But I remember tuning back in and realizing you guys had opened up and were basically helping a lot of different startups out. And I want to understand why you guys made that decision, and maybe in the context of your wider B2B strategy.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. That B2B or B2Web side of things, the very origins of it, at least for me, were asking our CFO, how do we turn finance into a revenue line? Because the feeling was that if you've got product, then you've got momentum. You want to improve it, etc. And we started thinking about data as a service. And one of the things that felt natural to us was we've got a shed load of quotes. I mean, it's billions and billions per day. And we feel good about the value we're providing for that. But there's the thing that's good for us is, that use of that data leading to more bookings makes commercial agreements more likely. But there was also the point that the data has cost resources, and both for us and just in generating it, etc. And so it should be used more widely. I think way back in the day, I used to talk about free GDS, and it was just this concept that actually this information should be ubiquitous, and that the value comes from other things, from from someone having the confidence to purchase. But generally in our industry, in flights, actually getting the information at all was a paid thing, which just put the kibosh on so many startups. So part of it was it's the right thing to do. Part of it was it would be good for us. And part of it was memory of just how painful it was for us when we kind of realized that actually this data is really, really hard to get hold of.
Very cool. No, I know the startup community is quite thankful. So, Kevin?
Yeah, so where was the first acquisition, Gareth?
I think that was Zumbu, Rachel and Alistair, with their multimodal. They definitely brought strong elements of what they'd built into Skyscanner, and became, leading execs at Skyscanner for quite some time. So I think that was our first one.
And was there any kind of degree of trepidation that, we're almost a grown-up startup now that we are actually making acquisitions?
That's a good point. Yeah, I don't remember thinking that. I think it was that just ever persistent. The sky's going to fall. We've got to move quicker, and that was therefore something that made a lot of sense to us, and thankfully did to them as well. So I don't remember noticing that milestone, as it were, which you're quite right to call out.
It's interesting. You said it just then. You always wonder if the sky was going to fall. I mean, did you feel like you were always on the back foot, or there was someone that was always going to come along and, massively overused word in this industry, disrupt? But did you always sense that there was something might come around the corner that might put you on the back foot a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think in retrospect, that sense of urgency, not paranoia, because they are after you, but was at a level that meant that we didn't recognize that actually we did have a bit more time and could think things through longer, and learned that a bit better over time. But overall, I think it was a net positive. And really, it was around, I think I've always seen it as or the way that I cast it in my own mind was, this is a question about how fast you can release quality software. That was the primary thing to solve. And that other things, it could be very big problems, but if you can't, the quicker you can release high quality and appropriate software to your users, the greatest chance you have of not being overtaken by a startup or being outcompeted by an incumbent.
Now, 16 years under your tenure is a fairly long time, but I would imagine the competitive threat landscape changed quite considerably over that time. Just briefly, I know David's got some thoughts on this that he wants to run by you, but who over those, let's say 15 years, put them into 5-year chunks, who did you see as the competitors, the main competitor or the brand that you were most worried about over those different 5-year periods?
I'd say Google was in each of those 3 periods.
Oh, okay.
And probably no greater or no less of a concern in any of those 3 periods, for different reasons over the course of time. At the very beginning, I remember we designed and we'd built and we'd not just built a website, but we'd built a back-end data system and lots of work. And getting towards the end of that probably 2-month period, I came across a UK site. I think it was called Apple Fares or Airfares, and it was like, oh, that's what we're trying to build. And I remember sitting back and thinking, we're too late, and being really, really despondent about it. And the same thing happened, a bit more research, and came across this really interesting browser extension called Sidestep. And you know, that was really worrying. And I hadn't learned that it was just about long periods of executing well, or as well as you can do. So at the beginning, it was things like that. And I think Stelios started a easy compare way back in time. Yep. Moving on a bit, of course, Kayak, from our perspective, sort of came out of nowhere and was, you know, raising money that I wasn't even sure how many zeros were involved. $250 million, you know, it's back in the day when a billion meant something, if you see what I mean. So that was quite scary, and I think that had a big impact because they were doing it in a different way, and it was kind of looked from the outside and I think from the inside as well, it was kind of working that way. So that caused some angst.
Sorry, when you say working that way, do you mean like it was working for them, that they were fundraising lots of money really quickly, as opposed to your kind of more traditional bootstrap? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. But also I think they did more than raise lots of money and spend it on advertising or whatever. They set out to build the best software company that they could, and they did really well at that. And so it was, you know, and they were an object lesson in achieving things at pace. So I think, you know, that definitely made us think a lot, and it made us try to speed up and influenced how we thought about funding and that sort of thing. I think in the end, things played out in the way that we'd kind of set up as, which was more around the bootstrapping side, more around the optimize, get better at something and then hire someone, rather than sort of bring people in and try and get better at the same time. Yeah, there's many answers to that, but Kayak were really impressive, because I reckon over the years there's probably been, you could have well, you'd probably know this better, Kevin, but I reckon there's been 250 funded companies, let alone the ones that didn't get funding, doing in a very similar space that we're in. And I think Kayak was the one where we went, oh, we are a bit worried about these guys. Later on, I think, you know, the last 5 years, I would say I've been more worried about horizontal players than vertical players. So what I mean by that is the companies out there that attempt to provide services for everything you need, whether it be via social or via hardware and software like Apple, or through e-commerce and Amazon. Those sorts of companies, I think, in the long term play, and obviously Google is one of those. And I think that's where it goes to another level, which is, in order to survive, you got to start doing much more and providing value across a wider spectrum of activity, which we've been doing, and is no small task that my illustrious successor has taken on at Skyscanner. I tried telling him it's about 2 weeks' work, but he wasn't having any of it.
Yeah, well, I wanted to just follow up on that, because you see obviously a lot of consolidation, and 90% of that is Priceline or I guess now Booking now, or Expedia buying just another flight search engine, but Booking bought OpenTable, of course, and they're moving into different verticals like that. How have you thought about that? I've heard from other OTAs about them going more local, and to even food delivery. I heard from one, and kind of along the lines of what you were saying about that transit app getting a lot more play because of frequency. So, what do you think? Two-part question here. What do you think of what the two big groups are doing, Expedia and Booking? And if you were, what would you think a good strategy would be for strategically expanding into more and more services?
Well, I think the detail around that is something that we've talked a lot about internally. So going into any detail, that's a question for Brian now, in terms of what things look like going forward. And I'm really excited about where we could end up. I mean, I would say exhaustion was a greater factor than any loss of ambition. And I think Skyscanner can still grow to 100 times potentially of where we are right now. So I think those things are incredibly important. I don't really want to talk about what our exact take on it is. But I suppose what I would say is that there's definitely a drive, an ever increasing drive towards winner takes all, which is an unfortunate consequence of the effects of internet technology and how that rolls out, and what the relative impact of variable and fixed costs, and how easy it is to gain customers in other countries, all those things. And that tends to then accentuate the land grab type things, like in the Uber scenarios, and kind of it means there is a danger that the way that we did it wouldn't work anymore. And I think it's an open question whether the luxury of funding has become the absolute requirement of funding, which would be a shame if that's the case. So my overall thing is, I think you've got to cast something as sufficiently big that you cover a big swathe of the information needs and e-commerce needs of a significant part of the world economy type thing.
It's interesting. You're just talking about the luxury versus requirement of funding. I mean, just broadly, I mean, you must look at the money that swirls around from venture capital and stuff like that and think, my goodness, what could we have done if we were starting now with what would be a nascent product? I mean, it's just extraordinary the amount of money that there is kicking about.
Yes. I mean, I don't know that we would have achieved a lot more, although we've had access to a lot of capital, and I think my success would do much better. In actual fact, we only spent $6 million of investors' money. So all value that was created only involved the spending of $6 million of investors' capital, which is pretty good capital efficiency. I think we had to learn the lessons as we go. I think one of the biggest problems in having a startup outside of the typical zones is how much you have to learn. You know, the ability to shortcut by hiring a third in charge at Twitter or wherever, of engineering or in marketing or in wherever. The amount that they bring, so it's a constant flow of shared techniques and learning that's living in the heads of the team. As founders, as CEOs, as people who join startups not in those centers, there is a real danger that you're not picking up that knowledge that you need. And I think it's way more significant than funding, although funding is an important issue. So kind of see raising capital is kind of like economic rent on time. And actually, if you're not prepared to sell something in order to gain time, someone else will.
It's interesting. I mean, just we're coming up into the last 5 or 10 minutes now. I'm curious. What do you, in the history of of Skyscanner, what do you think was the biggest kind of startup pain point that you had to face along that road? And how did you get over it or get through it?
Well, there were quite a few.
All right, give us the biggest one then.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think getting there was a point where we'd given absolutely everything we could, and for a while, it just had no effect. We tried to grow. We looked at marketing. We tried to raise our revenue per user, and that didn't work. We were trying to do releases, and they were taking a month or longer each to do, and it was just really dispiriting because everything we were trying to do didn't work.
Sorry, Gareth, just what period in time was that?
So that's probably about seven years ago, I would say. So we'd got big enough that you needed to really think about things. And what the good thing is that led to a period of like really doing well at mobile first. It started a process to genuine continuous release with huge number of testing and automated monitoring. So it led to good things, but it was an extremely painful period for us to kind of go, well, why isn't this working anymore?
But you got through it, obviously, and I think for a while, and maybe you still are, you were the most downloaded travel app around at one point. Is that right?
Yeah, and that was really, really great as that succeeded. That was probably the biggest sort of whoosh moment. But that's continued. So it's and and it is that thing is your revenues come from desktop, but your growth is coming from mobile. So many companies have seen that, and it's played out in so many different ways. And I think because we're very product focused, we weren't slow in going where our users were going.
So to wrap up here, I think it's appropriate to wrap up with this question, which is obviously you guys chose after so many years to sell to Ctrip. I would love to get kind of an anatomy of that acquisition, how it came about, what you guys were thinking, and and as much as you can tell us about how things are going now. Yeah,
we're kind of faced with either continuing as we were, or setting off the early motion for an IPO, or looking at acquisition options. In the end, I didn't think we were big enough to be the sort of IPO that we wanted to be, to have agency, to be able to make strategic decisions in the direction that we were going to go. And I could be wrong on that. Certainly, there was a lot of debate internally around that. But my feeling was we'd be a relatively small fish compared to the very large online travel companies, and certainly compared to the companies that had the decision making that can be achieved by Google's and Facebook's. So that looked a bit unattractive. I thought we're going to be put into, I don't know, price comparison or marketplace segmentation, and we're not going to do the transitions that we need to do.
Sorry, Gareth, just on that. I mean, Kayak went public though, didn't it?
Yes.
Catched up.
They'd done very well in making some of the transitions earlier than we did, but also they got bought, so
yeah, they weren't a public company for very long, admittedly. That's true.
So, and then when we looked at acquisition, we looked at what had worked before, and I think we came to the conclusion: is it of interest that we stay autonomous? And in the end, the majority acquiring company gets to make that decision, and as it should be. But we were very keen to at least express that we thought, as a team, we've got a long way to go. And that chimed. There's been a number of deals that have been on that basis, and that chimed with several other parties. I think the reason, from a personal perspective, the reason for going with C-Trip was severalfold, really. One was that it was an opportunity to witness from the front row some sort of global geopolitical history being made. The China joining, becoming biggest economy, and everything that flows from that is interesting, no matter what your take on it is. And so that was interesting. The second one was on the point of autonomy. We were pretty convinced that not only would they seek to provide anything they were reasonably able to provide to us, but they were completely aligned that they want us to continue growing the Skyscanner brand and to succeed in a global scale. And they've been extremely good on that front since then.
So a final one for me, just a quick one, and then David can wrap things up for us. Clearly our most reluctant CEO that we've had on so far, just going back to what you were saying initially.
Yeah.
Even though you are a reluctant CEO, tell us now that you're the chairperson, what do you miss most about being the CEO, if there is anything?
There is a lot. I've had my head down in mathematics books, basically making up for my awful performance at university. And so you definitely miss some of the adrenaline rush. And actually, there's a huge amount of camaraderie and shared experience that you go through when you go through a long period of intense, very intense work. So I'm still in touch with everybody, but I could see, they've still got that going, and I'm delighted to see the way that things are panning out. But yeah, I'm now watching and cheering rather than directly involved in it, and so yeah, maybe I became a bit addicted to something that I didn't initially. I thought it was mahogany panels and cigars and glass of port type thing. Was my previous impression.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah, well, very cool. Well, thanks for joining us today, Gareth. I think this has been quite illuminating. This has been How I Got Here, Mozio and PhocusWire's podcast with Kevin May from PhocusWire and myself, David Litwak from Mozio. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. And thanks again, Gareth.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more inside stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages. And get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.